Monkey experiments rarely lead to advances in human health. And when you start with dirty, toxic monkeys, failure is assured. Now, a former scientist at the Washington National Primate Research Center in Seattle has blown the whistle on her old workplace. Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel found the center is breeding sick monkeys in Arizona for primate experiments around the country. And they've known about this for years and done nothing to correct it. Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel tells her story next on the PETA podcast. Welcome to the PETA podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, a recent USA Today Arizona Republic investigative report focused primarily on damning documents obtained by Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel, once a researcher at the Washington National Primate Research Center, also known as WaNPRC, in Seattle, Washington. Dr. Jones-Engel began noticing how things weren't right at the facility. Animals, specifically monkeys, were getting sick and dying, and not due to the experiments, but because of WaNPRC's breeding facilities. Something was wrong with the monkeys. Dr. Jones-Engel told her bosses about irregularities she noticed that go back to as early as the 1990s, but those in charge did nothing. And then it got worse in 2010. Eventually, Jones-Engel was so frustrated, she left her job and became a scientist at PETA, where she used the Freedom of Information Act to get more than 10,000 pages of documents that WaNPRC's leaders didn't want to be made public. It tells how WaNPRC established its breeding facility ripe with valley fever, and that was next to another site contaminated with toxins. She shared all her findings with the USA Today and the Arizona Republic, and now the expose shows more than just poor management decisions at the Arizona breeding facility, but violations of state and federal law, toxic waste exposures that endanger public health, as well as an appallingly high death rate among monkeys that were then shipped to labs in Seattle and around the nation. WaNPRC was breeding and distributing toxic monkeys that diminished any chance of meaningful research, and all of it funded with hundreds of millions of dollars from NIH, the National Institutes of Health, whose director, Dr. Francis Collins, coincidentally announced his retirement this week. For Dr. Jones-Engel, blowing the whistle and exposing WaNPRC for its failings has become almost important as a career's worth of research. Now all that's left is the shutdown of WaNPRC and the remaining national primate research centers. Here's my conversation with Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel, now PETA's Senior Science Advisor on Primate Experimentation, on the PETA podcast. So you worked there for 14 years.
Correct. I was a primate scientist. I came there immediately after graduate school.
So you have a kind of an intimate knowledge of all the things that are in the report that was released, and you know about what they do there.
Yes, intimate is a really good way to describe it. Even while I was still within the primate center, these issues of unintended infections with tuberculosis is actually what I was focusing on. We knew about them. I brought these concerns to the WaNPRC leadership. I brought these concerns to the University of Washington leadership, and they chose to ignore them. They could ignore me. They're not able now to ignore PETA, and they're certainly not going to be able to ignore this USA Today article, this Arizona Republic article, because every single one of these details is out there now for people to read and to review the documents themselves.
Now, how frustrating was it for you, an ethical scientist, on the inside to see all this happening and then to be ignored by the powers that could do something about changing what you were seeing at the lab?
I like to say that WaNPRC and UW made me an animal rights activist. I certainly was not one during my years at the university in the Primate Center. But my absolute inability to get them to affect change, and this is change that would lead to better science, that would lead to better animal welfare. Their refusal to address these things, their absolute denial of their existence, they made me who I am today. They pushed me out into the animal rights world, where I found that, you all, now me, you already knew these things. You were already reporting the truth. And what I've done is just to help kind of fill in all the bits and details of what the animal rights community understood from the beginning.
So we're going to come back to how you're feeling about all this being exposed, but let's get back to WaNPRC and the facility that's in Arizona that WaNPRC leased. Tell me about that facility and how is it connected?
The University of Washington, the WaNPRC, has had over the past 60 years, they've had their monkey colonies spread in different places. Sometimes it's been in Seattle. They still have their research colony is in Seattle. For a while, they had their breeding colony in Eastern Washington. They had some of their colony in Alice, Texas. They've had it in Tulane National Primate Research Center, in the New Iberia Research Center. They've had it spread everywhere. They decided back in about 2010 that they wanted to consolidate their breeding colony into one place where they would have control over these animals, ostensibly to improve their oversight, to reduce their costs per monkey, and to, in theory, make healthier, more monkeys for the biomedical research community. Because what they were seeing in Texas and in Louisiana was that those monkeys were dying. The females were aborting their offspring. There were diarrheal diseases. Animals were getting sick for other things. So with these documents that we got by suing UW, because UW operations like this only exist in the dark. And UW has done everything in their power to keep PETA from accessing these documents. So we actually, back in the end of 2020, had to sue UW in order for them to release these public records. What we saw in these records was evidence that the university had two choices of where they could put this new breeding colony. They could have gone to the Alamogordo Air Force Base in New Mexico, which was kind of, at that point in 2010, the chimps were leaving. There would have been space for monkeys, or they could go to this facility down in Arizona, in Mesa, Arizona, which was also a prior chimp facility. What the documents also showed us was that the Arizona facility, it previously had chimpanzees on it that were used in biomedical research. They knew at that time, it was well established in the literature, that those chimpanzees were being infected with something called valley fever. Valley fever is where a lot of this story turns on. And so valley fever is a fungus that actually hangs out in the soil, and it's very common throughout the South and Southwest of the US. When the soil is disrupted, the fungus kind of comes up into the air, and people or other animals can inhale it, and then that fungus can cause disease in that person. Now, if your immune system is intact, if you're healthy and you've got a strong immune system, if you get exposed to this fungus, generally it's not a big deal. You can take care of it, and you don't tend to get very sick. But if your immune system is compromised, that's a different story. This fungus can make you very, very sick. And so back in the late 90s, they already knew that it was making the chimpanzees at that facility sick. And yet, WaNPRC and the University of Washington Board of Regents and the Attorney General, a special assistant to the Attorney General, all of these folks were involved in leasing this facility. This facility is on tribal land. And so that's why there were a lot of people involved in the leasing of this. apparently no one was doing their due diligence, because not only was this site contaminated with this fungus that they knew caused disease in non-human primates, but the site, this breeding site, was also about less than 500 meters from the Namotali toxic waste site. When we first got that document, I remember when I first saw this document in this, it came in with 1,000 other pages. It was just buried in the middle of this 1,000 pages. And it was a legal document where Namotali, which is a global munitions arms dealer, was actually suing their insurance agencies. And I remember thinking, what, Namotali, Allstate, what is this? And I read through it. I'm like, I had no idea. I mean, absolutely, I had no clue what this was. And it wasn't until I did a Google search and threw in Namotali into Google, and I thought, I added Mesa, Arizona, that I realized that actually this facility, this former munitions facility, had been designated by the Arizona Department of Equality a hazardous waste site, because the toxins from the exploding munitions and from the other things that they were developing at the site actually had contaminated the soil and had contaminated the water.
All right, now this is a lot here. So we got
This is a lot.
This is got the Primate Center with this leased area in Mesa where the colony is, and it's next to this munitions
toxic waste site.
A toxic. So now, tell me how this all connect the dots here. How does the toxic waste site connect with this animal colony in Mesa that's leased by WaNPRC in Seattle? Let's connect the dots.
It took me a long time to connect the dots. So the former primate facility is on tribal land. So that facility was established back in the 1970s. It was called the Primate Foundation of Arizona, PFA. That facility basically went out of business. All the chimps were given and sold to biomedical research, but the infrastructure, the houses and the caging was still there. WaNPRC was looking around for some place to move their monkeys. They saw that the infrastructure was there, and they said, hey, there used to be primates here. Let's put our monkeys here. What WaNPRC didn't do, or didn't acknowledge, or didn't admit to, was knowing that that site was already contaminated with this fungus that causes disease in those chimpanzees, and one would expect would cause disease in the monkeys that were coming there. And WaNPRC also didn't, even though they must have known, because someone at the university had this legal document from Namotali, which said, hey, there is a contaminated toxic waste site 500 meters, less than 500 meters from where you're planning on dropping these macaques. Somebody didn't do their homework. Someone didn't do their due diligence, or someone just didn't care.
So the effect of putting the macaques in this new site that is near the toxic site, did it have an impact on the macaques, and did that have an impact on any research done there?
So once we realized that just a few hundred meters from all of these macaques, and we're talking, WaNPRC put the colony there beginning in 2013. And so they've had 500, 600, 700 monkeys there every year. Once we realized that these monkeys were there and that the toxic waste site was contaminated with things like perchlorate and lead and volatile organic chemicals, we actually put in a FOIA to the Arizona Department of the Environment and said, tell us about this. Is it possible that WaNPRC knew that the site was contaminated, and what have they done? We got hundreds of pages back, and it became very clear that the wells that supply the Primate Center were contaminated with perchlorates, that this massive plume, this underground plume of contaminated water, was moving rapidly towards the Primate Center wells. We knew the soil was contaminated with lead. We knew that, and it was also apparent that the University of Washington had been notified as early as 2014 that the water and the soils were contaminated, and that they needed to be prepared to take remedial actions for this.
And did they do it?
It doesn't appear that they did.
And that's one of the major concerns, one of the major things that come out of this reporting.
Exactly.
How irresponsible is that?
It's mind-blowing. It's the breeding colony is the most fragile of the primate colonies, because think about it. You have the moms, you have the infants, you have these animals who are at their most fragile, a pregnant mother, a fetus, a newborn infant. And yet UW, WaNPRC, had placed their colony in a place where the moms would be exposed to perchlorates, which affects the thyroid. The infants would be exposed to these perchlorates and lead and all these other toxins at a time when these animals are at their most vulnerable. You know, we know very well from human studies the impact of lead on developing human brains. We would expect the exact same thing in these infant monkeys. And what we see is that there's an astonishingly high mortality rate in infants and stillborns at this facility.
So the monkeys were impacted almost immediately by being exposed, but the monkeys who were able to survive, they went back up to WaNPRC to be part of experiments, right?
Exactly. And the thing is that, no, you asked earlier, can we point to a direct line between the exposure to perchlorate and lead and these other toxins, the exposure that these monkeys had, and whether or not that had an impact on their health, their well-being, and their use as biomedical models? That's a really good question. And that is a fundamental question in behavioral research, because if, as a biomedical community operates, you see these animals as a research tool. They don't see them as individual animals. They're just a tool. But the expectation within the biomedical community is that your tools are all in good working order. You know, they're clean, they're sharp, they're not contaminated with any rust, or there's not broken bits and pieces. WaNPRC, according to the documents that we have, made absolutely no effort to let the people the investigators that they sell these animals to, the investigators that use these animals, know that they had these early toxic exposures.
So the experiments weren't necessarily done at WaNPRC. They were done to wherever they sold these monkeys to. So it could have spread out.
Absolutely. So the breeding colony in Arizona, there's no research that goes on at the breeding colony in Arizona. That colony was solely established and paid for by tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer dollars to breed and produce monkeys. From there, then WaNPRC's job was to either send them up to Seattle, to the research facility up here in Seattle, and or send them to other facilities around the country where investigators would use them for other types of research. The pigtail macaque was predominantly, that colony was established to be used in HIV/AIDS research. That is the main use for that animal. However, we know based on our documents that they're also used in other things. They're used in neurobiology studies. They're used in other vaccine studies. But predominantly they were designed to be used in HIV/AIDS research.
Did it compromise any of that research because these animals were somehow contaminated by where they were born?
One of the things that the article does well is to point out that since the WaNPRC never acknowledged both the potential and the likelihood and the fact that these animals were exposed, were exposed to these toxins, they never made any effort then to assess what that impact, what that exposure had on them. And in order to have done that, they would have had to take a pigtailed macaque that wasn't born and raised next to a toxic waste dump and compare that with, so you need a clean monkey, an untoxic monkey, and a toxic monkey. And you have to compare the biology, the immunology of those two animals to know what that toxic exposure did to that animal. And WaNPRC never did that.
So we don't really know the extent, but you just described them as toxic monkeys. It can't be good.
There was no quality assurance. For the biomedical community, these monkeys are tools. They talk about quality assurance. None of that was done at WaNPRC. No effort was done. There was, they were taking toxic monkeys and just sending them out and assigning them to research without letting people know. And this is just there's this whole other problem, this whole other enormous issue of, it wasn't just the toxic exposures. These monkeys were also infected with valley fever and a bunch of other unintended infections.
Just by being in that area, because valley fever was
endemic. Yeah. It's naturally occurring. Exactly. One of the other documents that we came across was a 2017 report from one of the veterinarians, the head veterinarian at that facility in Arizona. And he wrote, it was a, 10, 12 page report where he said, whoa, valley fever is killing our monkeys in this facility. And not only is it killing our monkeys in this facility, we need to be really concerned about for the monkeys that are surviving valley fever and that we're then sending off to be assigned to research studies. We need to be really concerned about what that impact of their exposure to an infection with valley fever will have on their immune systems and what that will mean when these animals are assigned to infectious disease protocols. Unintended infections. I use this word over and over again because the presence of an unintended infection will impact your research studies. That's why we have pathogen-free colonies. A scientist needs to know precisely what it is in the monkey that they're getting, or the mouse, or the zebrafish, or whatnot. You have to know the health status of that animal. And WaNPRC was not transparent about that. And they got busted for it.
Yeah. But also the bigger issue is that you know that in many instances, experimenting on monkeys will not necessarily get you human results. So it's kind of like a dead end to begin with. But when you start off with toxic monkeys, it's almost like it makes all your entire activity moot in a way.
Exactly. And for me, I think, Emil, this was an aha moment. These past 9 months that I've lived inside of these documents and to understand that the majority of the US breeding colonies, whether from the National Primate Research Centers or our commercial breeding colonies, actually are located in the South and Southwest parts of this country. And these are the same places where valley fever are. These are the hot spots for valley fever. And so kind of all the pieces dropped into place for me. I'm thinking, wow, we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars to breed monkeys in locations where we are exposing them to a pathogen that compromises their immune system. The act of doing that and then sending them off and putting them on an HIV study or a COVID study or a Zika vaccine study. Is there any wonder that they have failed for the last 35 years to generate any safe and effective vaccines using monkeys? No, because they've never understood what their monkey is made of at this point. What their monkey is actually coming into their cage with. And that's astonishing.
So how long did this take place where WaNPRC was dealing with the facility in Mesa that was near the toxic site? How many years has this been going on, and how many monkeys are we talking about, with the possibility of affecting? How much research would you estimate?
So WaNPRC first started negotiating with the Salt River Pima India tribe back in 2010, 2011, to get access to this facility. They actually put their first monkeys there in 2013. The irony is that they populated that breeding facility with monkeys from their Texas holding facility, their Alice, Texas holding facility, that had just 2 years prior to that had an outbreak of tuberculosis. They began with dirty monkeys. They began with monkeys that had already been exposed to pathogens that anyone worth their scientific salt knows you cannot start with an animal that's diseased if you're expecting them to be a model for your study. It's ridiculous. But WaNPRC didn't care. They founded that colony with monkeys that had been part of a TB outbreak. They brought over monkeys from New Iberia in Louisiana and Tulane that are infected with Chagas disease, monkeys that were infected with Campylobacter, Shigella, Yersinia. They had cholera in there. It is looking at these pathology reports, and I've gone through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pathology reports. These monkeys were so sick. It's impossible. The lack of intellectual curiosity, scientific integrity, of transparency, it's almost unfathomable. If I hadn't read every single word myself, I would not have believed that a National Primate Research Center was capable of this type of malfeasance.
Yeah, it does sound like they're the height of irresponsibility if they don't even check to see if the monkeys were appropriate or healthy or good media for any kind of research at all. And it sounds like, and you read the documents, so they had to know, or someone just allowed these monkeys to go on through without any kind of vetting.
WaNPRC leadership knew. National Institutes of Health leadership knew. Other scientists within the National Primate Research Center community knew. WaNPRC scientists themselves knew. They published a paper in December of 2020 in a high impact journal that said, we were actually doing a study, looking at using these monkeys, these pigtail macaques, for SIV. And yeah, one of the monkeys, it turned out, was infected with valley fever, but we thought they were okay. They had been infected, and then we had, the staff had treated the monkeys with fluconazole. We thought they were cured. They didn't have any evidence of infection. So we went ahead, we put them on this study, this SIV study, and we immunocompromised them. And all of a sudden, the monkey got really, really, really sick. And so we killed that monkey, and we took it to necropsy, and we opened it up, and we realized that actually this valley fever infection had, their term, recrudesced, meaning that the infection had come back. The monkey, when it wasn't on study, the monkey was able, his immune system had kind of walled it off. It shut down the infection. But then that monkey went from the Arizona facility up to a cage in Seattle by himself. He got infected with this intentionally, experimentally infected, and his immune system couldn't handle it anymore. So this valley fever infection came back out. And in this paper, these investigators, so these are WaNPRC scientists, WaNPRC pathologists, WaNPRC veterinarians, they concluded that any monkey that has been exposed to or infected with valley fever should not be used on studies involving SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus. Emil, that should be game over.
Yeah.
At that point.
They knew.
Game over. They knew.
So why do you suppose they kept going?
I can't figure that one out.
I mean,
the cynical part of me was because, it's part of this juggernaut of biomedical research. They got 500-600 monkeys down there. They've got their NIH grants to do these studies. They need monkeys. I'm putting that in air quotes. So they're just like, oh, well, let's just keep on going forward. I'm kind of speechless because I have spent many a sleepless night over the last 18 months trying to sort this out. As a scientist, if you know that your tool, your animal, your model is so profoundly compromised and confounded because of this infection, then you cannot, with any sense of integrity or honesty, use that animal. And this is what they published in their paper. They themselves said, we should not, animals who are exposed to this, who've been infected, should not be used.
So, Lisa, I'm just going to go through the bullet points here, because in this letter that was written by PETA to the Department of Health and Human Services, it's pretty clear. There's just a long list of concerns. And you just jump in because I think you've covered pretty much all of it, but failure to maintain biosecurity. That's the being next to the toxic site, right?
That's being next to the toxic site. That's having monkeys that are infected with valley fever and with or unintended infections with valley fever, simian retrovirus, Chagas, Campylobacter, Shigella, Yersinia, Salmonella, cholera. And that's just the ones I can roll off the tip of my tongue right now.
Yeah. And that's a big one, failure to maintain biosecurity. How about violations of state health and veterinary regulations?
In March, PETA went to the Washington State Department of Agriculture and said, we have documents from WaNPRC that show that they have been importing sick and diseased monkeys from Arizona up into Seattle, and yet they have falsely labeled these documents. We took several hundred pages. We gave them to the Washington State Department of Agriculture. They came back and said, wow. So WaNPRC, UW, had failed. So they had imported diseased animals. They had failed to get the necessary import permits. They had failed to get the necessary certificates of veterinary inspections. And this is the kicker, they had failed to report a notifiable condition. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet is the implications for public health. The movement, there's a reason why we have lists of notifiable conditions. The departments of health and departments of ags around this country have these lists of pathogens that they want to know if any human or non-human animal shows up in your state and a veterinarian or a physician identifies this infection, you're required to report this to the Department of Health or the Department of Ag. Because that's what public health is about, knowing how infectious diseases move around this country. WaNPRC did not do this. And when the Department of Ag said to them, really? They said, oh, I'm sorry, we didn't know, we got confused. We didn't know we were supposed to. And sorry about not filling out the documents, that prior vet left and we just didn't know. And to which I say, bull hockey. You are a federally funded institution. You've been getting $1 billion over the last 60 years. And you mean to tell me that you don't know the regulations that are in place to protect public health and to protect the integrity of the biomedical model? No, shame on you, WaNPRC. Again, you are breaking the law and you are not being transparent and you're lying.
Yeah, and it also shows the real concern of where the real concern of the public should be, because this goes
Exactly.
directly to the issue of public health. Uh,
Yes.
let's move another point: environmental racism. I guess because they were dealing with the Native American communities.
Exactly. So WaNPRC placed this breeding facility on the Salt River Pima Indian lands. First of all, that means that the Arizona Department of Ag, the Arizona Department of Health, the Fish and Wildlife Service in Arizona, none of them have any oversight into what goes on those lands.
Right.
So there is no one watching. And at the same time, WaNPRC has been bringing into this state, placing on these tribal lands, monkeys that are sick with valley fever, with Chagas, and with all these other diarrheal diseases that we talked about earlier. There's a pattern of this, and this is called environmental racism. It's taking and dumping, in this case, sick monkeys on lands where people have historically dumped things because there's not been the pushback, there's not been the awareness, there's not been the power for those people to speak up and say, don't do this on our land.
But didn't some people of the in the tribes benefit from the lands being leased?
So it's the early documents that we got show that the tribe was pretty well divided on whether or not this facility should be allowed to come in. There were tribal members who were concerned about the primates escaping. They raised concerns about infectious disease. In the end, UW paid, the initial lease was for $60,000 a year, which is, that's dirt cheap.
That's nothing.
That is that is nothing. You know, UW is paying $3 million a year to lease a facility downtown where they keep some of their monkeys. So 60 grand is just, I mean, that's nothing to them.
They lowballed the tribes.
Exactly.
All right, let's keep going on toxic waste exposures. We went into that. Clearly, people were exposed.
People are exposed. The workers there are exposed. The monkeys are drinking this water. The cages are being cleaned with this water. These monkeys are indoor, outdoors, so the soils are blowing around. So that's why the valley fever is showing up and the lead contamination.
Now, how about apparent financial mismanagement?
In 2018, WaNPRC was reviewed by the National Scientific Advisory Board. And this is a board of peers who came in, and this board is required by the National Institutes of Health in order for WaNPRC to get its money. This board of peers wrote down very clearly that the financial situation that WaNPRC is facing is almost insurmountable. They were so deeply in debt. They were hemorrhaging staff. They were hemorrhaging scientists. They cutting corners at every possible place that they could, which meant that the science was suffering and the animals were suffering because there simply weren't enough people to take care of these things. WaNPRC is in absolute financial freefall.
Next point, appalling and unexplained death rate among monkeys. You covered that. They were just dying. They couldn't explain it.
And again, this is a breeding colony. Your job is to make baby monkeys. So if you have a 25% mortality rate, you are doing something really wrong and you better understand and figure out why.
And then the final point, multiple violations of animal protection laws. They must have known that they were in violation, or what? When they were caught, they just ignored it or played dumb, right?
So they would report their violations of the Animal Welfare Act. But the astonishing thing is that the same thing kept happening over and over again. WaNPRC can't even do something as basic, as fundamental as keep the animals safely in their cages or their corrals. Again and again, animals would get out and their limbs would get mauled by other animals. They'd have amputations. Animals were dying because they couldn't even keep them in the cage. And at times they would lose monkeys completely and not even report this.
See, this is pretty incredible. All these point by point things, we talked in general about this earlier, and the documents are there. You read them. They have now been reported out to the public. What is your hope that will happen now that the information is no longer being swept under a rug, that it's been exposed, that people see it, it's been in USA Today, the Arizona Republic. What is your hope now? What should happen at the federal level?
WaNPRC is in the final year of a 5-year cycle of its main funding grant from the National Institutes of Health. This funding will run out in April of 2022. This is the perfect timing for NIH to shut this center down, for the University of Washington to follow Harvard's lead. The exact same situation happened just a few years ago. Harvard, too, found themselves in financial difficulty. They found themselves running deeply afoul of the Animal Welfare Act. Staff were leaving. And Harvard closed the New England Primate Research Center. UW needs to do that right now. They have 6 or 8 months of funding. Use that to wind the studies down, to then transfer all of these monkeys to reputable sanctuaries. Let them live out their lives in a non-toxic waste site, in a non-contaminated soil area. Let them be the macaques that they deserve to be. They've taken enough. They've taken so much from these animals, and they've gotten nothing in return. And when I say, and we've gotten nothing, the scientific community has gotten nothing. The taxpayer has gotten nothing. Experiments on diseased, distressed, caged monkeys are cruel, and they are not the pathway to human health. And so NIH, WaNPRC, UW, stop. Shut it down. There is nothing there for you.
And there is, I mean, to play devil's advocate, people might say, oh, there is research to be done. We will have lost research if we shut this down. Without these monkeys, we need these monkeys. You say,
look at the data. Look at the history. We have been promised for decades that using monkeys would improve human health. Using monkeys would get us vaccines sooner. We got the COVID vaccine not because any of the NPRC monkeys were used, not a single, not one monkey from the National Primate Research Center was used in the development of the COVID or of the Pfizer or the Moderna or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Not one. And what we especially learned through COVID is that studies that rely on monkeys are misleading. And that's because these monkeys, not only do these monkeys have very different biology and immunology, I think that what we can point to now is that for these last 3, 4, 5 decades, we've been using monkeys that have had unintended infections that have compromised the research, that has confounded the research. These monkeys have simply not, there's a saying, mice don't tell the truth and monkeys lie. Monkeys don't lie, but breeding monkeys in contaminated sites next to toxic waste centers guarantees you that those animals are sick and that those animals represent nothing like a model of human biology and immunology.
So it would not be too drastic if, in response to this report, in response to the digging up of these documents and the evidence as their own documentation that PETA has shared with the media, it would not be too drastic a situation just to shut it down.
Shut it down, and everyone should go to PETA.org, sign the petitions. We've got petitions to the University of Washington. We're reaching out to Congress. We're reaching out to Health and Human Services. And we're saying it's time. We're in the 21st century. This is time for modern science. This is the time where we have seen this explosion in the last 24 months of techniques that do not rely on misleading animal models. So shut the primate centers down. WaNPRC we've laid it all out there for you. National Institutes of Health, Secretary Becerra, make the decision, shut this one down right now. And we're then, trust me, we're going to lay out the same arguments for every one of these other primate centers that have these exact same issues. Several of them have valley fever. Well, not all of them are right next to a toxic waste site. That's a UW specialty. But they all have confounders, whether it's infections in the animals, whether it's poorly characterized models, whether it's the way that they cage the animals, that have guaranteed that these animals are not the way that we get improvements in human health. And PETA is here now, and we're going to make sure that everyone knows that in every single one of these NPRCs, in every single one of these commercial lab and commercial breeding facilities, the tool, that monkey tool, it is broken beyond repair. And the only thing to do is to stop, shut them down, send those animals to sanctuary, and let the scientists who are not relying upon these outdated animal models give them the funding that they deserve, that they need to make sure that humans get the treatments that they too deserve and need, and that they have paid for the last 60 years.
Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel, thank you very much for letting us know about the toxic monkeys.
Thank you very much, Emil.
Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel, now PETA's Senior Science Advisor on Primate Experimentation, on how her whistleblowing efforts could lead to the shutdown of the Washington National Primate Research Center, aka WaNPRC, and the other remaining centers in the country. Harvard has already shut down its facility. Read Dr. Jones-Engel's concerns in the investigative reporting done by USA Today and the Arizona Republic. Then take action against WaNPRC and the nation's 6 other primate research centers. Go to PETA.org for more. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or see my vlog at amok.com. Or see my writing at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's at ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.